we continue in that spirit through experiencing 3 20-minute prayer services traditional to diverse faith communities. And our moderator, Teresa Arthur, will introduce each tradition. Thank you, Teresa.
Welcome back and good morning again. My name is Teresa Arthur and I'm the moderator for the 2 prayer sessions that we are going to be having before and after the lunch break. It's going to be an interfaith, absolute interfaith interactive prayer service. So we would have the Roman Catholic tradition, the Islamic and the Baha'i traditions before lunch. Interfaith discourse is about seeking commonalities as well as acknowledging differences. In doing so, this conference hopes to promote greater interfaith understanding with people affirming a respect for the religious beliefs of others. Today, the conference as well seeks to render the teachings of faith groups, which includes the virtues of tolerance, understanding, compassion, and brotherhood. This is being done today through homilies and prayer supplications in which faith leaders will share the tenets and spiritual practices of their faith. Participants will witness firsthand the spiritual prayer traditions of different faith groups. So we begin with the Christian prayer offering led by Father Owen Connolly. Father Connolly will speak to us of the Sermon on the Mount, which he says is Jesus' Magna Carta and encapsulates the very basis of Christian teaching. He's assistant pastor and part-time chaplain of the QE2 Hospital. He has spent most of his life in parish ministry and in hospital chaplaincy, living a simple life, never forgetting where he has come from and where he is going. I know him as someone who knows that humility keeps people in touch with reality. I'll give you Father Connolly.
Good morning. Father Karl Rahner, a German Jesuit and one of the most influential theologians in the 20th century in the Roman Catholic tradition, said sometime before his death, perhaps 35 years ago, the only Christians who will survive in the 21st postmodern world will be those who are mystics. At the time, I don't think this statement resonated with the Catholic world the same way as it does today. For as time goes on, and we go deeper and deeper into the 21st century, many are beginning to realize just how important this insight should be for us. Why, to me, is this so challenging for Westerners? I believe it's so challenging because I sense that we are very uncomfortable with the whole notion of mystery. We are cerebral people, in many ways dualistic. And so if we are not able to explain an event through our highly technical minds, then we tend to dismiss it. We have great difficulty simply standing before the mystery. And when we are forced to confront the whole mystery of life, we are unable, like Moses, to just take off our shoes and allow the mystery to wash over us. And as the mystery washes over us, it tends to unfold before us. But this involves living from our hearts and not from our heads. And yet we teach that the way in which we come to faith is by listening with our ears, believing in our hearts, and professing with our lips. It's the heart that we struggle with, because it tends to be very difficult to control our hearts. The way in which we enter into a mystery is not through study or research, but rather through prayer. And that's just not saying prayers, but rather through contemplative prayer. Now, contemplative prayer virtually disappeared in the Christian tradition after the 16th century. A variety of reasons why. Mystical prayer was not practiced in our schools of formation, but was rather taught as a subject. And so what happened in effect was that we came to know about mystical prayer, but had not really practiced it in our lives. However, in the middle of the 20th century, there came along a man by the name of Thomas Merton, who once again introduced us to the practice of contemplation. He showed us that contemplation is not only a very important part of our prayer, but rather, contemplation was the way the early church fathers prayed. Men like Ignatius of Antioch, Cyprian, the Cappadocian Fathers, and Augustine were great contemplatives, men of deep prayer. However, at the end of the 4th century, history tells us things took a great change when Christianity became the official religion of the empire. And now the church began to move in a very different direction, moving from the minority to the majority, and this changed our outlook on life, and of course, greatly affected the way we as Christians lived and prayed. Instead of living out of our poverty, we began to become part of the majority, and in many ways took on the ways of the world. Mystical theology was now being threatened. However, in response to this movement, holy men and women went off into the Egyptian desert in the 3rd and 4th centuries to pray. They were not necessarily great scholars, but rather they were people of deep prayer. People who dedicated themselves to prayer, work, and contemplation. And at the door of each of these monasteries, one would discover a strong ministry to the poor. It was a great outreach. Thomas Merton in the 20th century was the first to observe that these people were like Zen masters. Among them were, of course, great mystical theologians, including a learned Greek by the name of Evagrius of Pontus, who said, "The theologian is one who prays, and one who prays is a theologian." It's not in study but in prayer that we come to not only know about God, but rather we come to meet God personally. With the advent of the Second Vatican Council in 1961, the Fathers of the Council paid great tribute to the enormous contribution of Eastern Christianity when they said, and I quote, "Moreover, in the East are to be found the riches of those spiritual traditions to which monasticism gives special expression. From the glorious days of the Holy Fathers, there flourished in the East that monastic spirituality which later flowed over into the Western world, and there provided a source from which Latin monastic life took its rise and has often drawn fresh vigor ever since. Therefore, Catholics are strongly urged to avail themselves more often of those spiritual riches of the Eastern Fathers, riches which lift up the whole person to the contemplation of the divine mysteries." For myself, I'm much indebted to another Jesuit by the name of William Johnson, who died about 2010. But he since spent 60 years of his adult life in the Orient. He received a doctorate and later taught at Sophia University and became the director of Oriental Studies at Sophia University, and he published the book Mystical Theology, The Science of Love, a wonderful book. In this book, he addresses the renewed interest in mysticism by people of all faiths in the 3rd millennium. It's not just addressed to celibate monks, but also to modern people who work in offices and factories, classrooms, and hospitals. people who are grappling with the questions of justice and peace and the protection of the environment. Mysticism is about relationships, relationship with our God, relationship with one another. Perhaps the two best mystics in the 20th century in the Roman Catholic tradition are Mother Teresa and John Vanier. It's very interesting that an ancient mystic once said that if we are praying in a room and we cannot hear the cry of a child in the room next door, our prayer is not authentic. And so it's interesting to note that these two people, two giants of people, are deeply spiritual people who, through different but quite similar experiences from both sides of the world, hear the word of God being directly spoken to them in their hearts, and they leave their secure lives and decide to follow Jesus in poverty, simplicity, and obedience to God's will. How do they do this? In very simple ways. With Mother Teresa gathering a few volunteers around her to respond to the needs of people in Calcutta who were virtually dying in the streets unattended. And she simply went out and began to comfort them by bringing them into a shelter, attending to their basic needs for bathing, for food, for comfort, and for companionship. Someone once asked her how she thought she was going to do this, and she said simply, one person at a time. Jean Vanier, on the other hand, heard the call of God while he was teaching philosophy at the University of Toronto. And the call was simply to go out and minister to the needs of people with mental disabilities, especially those with Down syndrome. And he invited two of them to come and live with him in a simple home in Trolly in southern France. There he planned only to provide a home environment for them. Very warm, very simple, truly gospel-based. But unexpectedly, there arose from that little home a movement that spread to many countries in the world. What inspired these two mystics to move out? It was simply the fascination with the Sermon on the Mount. And the Sermon on the Mount, as Teresa mentioned in is Matthew's Gospel, it's the Magna Carta of Jesus' teaching. And it's not just a teaching that we become familiar with, but rather a teaching that we're called to put into practice every day of our lives. They did not begin by forming a study group to see what the document could mean. They simply went forth and put it into practice in their daily lives. What is the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes? It's the basic teaching of the gospel and should be to the Christian what the Ten Commandments are to the Hebrew people. It is the terms of the Christian covenant. As Moses ascended the mountain and received from God the guidelines for life, so did Jesus ascend to the mountain and deliver to those who were to become his followers the guidelines for Christian living. Those who take these words and apply them in their lives are called Christian. For the real meaning of the term Christian is to be a Christ bearer, to bear the teachings and the life of Christ in our lives. These teachings are intended for all people of goodwill, and I was really struck many years ago in reading Gandhi's Philosophy of Nonviolence and learning that he had based this teaching on the Sermon on the Mount. What a wonderful, wonderful example. Gandhi was a devout Hindu, of course, and a great admirer of Jesus. He knew the teachings of Jesus much better than most Christians of his era. This was also the inspiration for people like Archbishop Tutu and for Martin Luther King. They each, as Pope Francis does today, rose at 4 a.m. to pray over the Scriptures. So let us then listen to the words of the Sermon on the Mount from Matthew's Gospel. When he saw the crowds, Jesus went up the mountain. And after he had sat down, his disciples came to him. He began to teach them, saying, "Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the land. Blessed are they who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they will be satisfied. Blessed are the merciful, for they will be shown mercy. Blessed are the clean of heart, for they will see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God. Blessed are they who are persecuted for the sake of righteousness, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Blessed are you when they insult you and persecute you, and utter every kind of evil against you falsely because of me. Rejoice and be glad, for your reward will be great in heaven. For it is thus they persecuted the prophets who were before you." So for us as Christians, the words of the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew's Gospel are what we are called to be. One of our great challenges in the Christian church today is that we have what I would call a power outage. We teach and we believe that the parabola of transformation in life is the passion, death, and resurrection of our Lord Jesus Christ. There are far too many Christians in the world today trying to come to the resurrection without being willing to go through the passion and death. Christianity is not a label that we wear, but a life that we live. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Connolly.